exist to see God glorified and disciples multiplied through the power of the gospel. What can miserable Christians sing? This is the question that Carl Trueman asked 3 different congregations on 3 different occasions, and each time he asked it, he was met with laughter. And a little bit understandably, it's a strange question to be asked. The first time I heard him pose the question, my answer was, well, miserable Christians don't sing. Because to be a Christian is to be joyful, obviously. But Dr. Trueman was not referring to the unconverted, but to true regenerate, born-again Christians who are going through miserable times and trials. What is there for them to sing in our churches? Some of you know that when I came to Horicon, I was shocked to learn, after I had already agreed to come and fly down with my family, that I was to lead the congregation in song. And so I remember almost panicking and talking to Nathan Herman, who was leading the pastoral search committee, and I was like, what do I do? And he said, well, just stand up there and move your lips. And so that's what I did. And obviously it was good enough at least to get the gig, because here I am. And something I didn't expect is that as I was at the church, I realized that I could not just stand up there and move my lips. Because we have a lovely congregant, love the guy to death. And he sings joyfully and loudly and out of tune every single Sunday in the front row. And it was confusing the congregation. And so I realized I got to learn how to sing. And so a lot of this first year for me has been learning how to develop as a music leader and as a worship leader. And it has been absolutely wonderful. It's not a role that I would have sought out in myself. I never would have desired it. I never would have gone. We get someone who can sing. I'm passing the mic. The first thing I can do. But I loved leading the congregation in worship. And then on top of that, being able to pick songs and selections that matched with the theme of the sermon. In most of the churches that I've been in, whether traditional or contemporary, it's usually 3 songs we like, a sermon, and then an ending song. And most of them have no connection with one another. But because I preached verse by verse, as we encountered different themes and topics, I was able to pick songs and scriptures and prayers that all interwove the liturgy together. The problem I kept having is that when we got to a passage about trials or suffering or persecution, I had a degree of difficulty selecting the hymns for that week. I've been preaching through John, and it got even more difficult when I got to the upper room discourse, because in John 13 through 16, that's when Jesus tells his disciples, hey, one of you is going to betray me. I'm leaving. You can't follow me. Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. The world is going to hate you. The world is going to reject you. The world is even going to kill you, and they're going to think that they're serving God in the process. There's some dark passages in that. There's some wonderful words of comfort. But as I struggled to find hymns that matched the mood of the upper room, and as I was doing that, I kept asking myself, why is that? Why do so few of the songs that we sing reflect on the theme of suffering and trials? And that brings us back to our question. What do miserable Christians sing? Like Nathan was saying, I was supposed to speak at the APF a few months ago, and as I was thinking about this message, it was right after the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and I asked myself, if I was a parent of one of the children who was slaughtered by the gunman as police waited out in the corridors, how could I honestly express myself in worship on Sunday morning? How could I do that? And then my mother-in-law, at the age of 51, passed away of ovarian cancer. And this question became much more real to me, much more real to my wife, as we longed to be able to express ourselves in worship, because the songs that our church had weren't prepared for that level of suffering. And if we're being honest, much of our music today is not equipped to deal with the complex emotions of the average Christian. And let me say, this is not a conversation about traditional hymns versus contemporary music. Today, I'm going to criticize both 20th century hymns and 21st century modern worship songs, because most of these songs in the 19th, 20th, 21st century express one emotion, and that would be joy. And of course, it's not a bad thing to express joy. We worship a risen Savior. We have much hope in the gospel. We have much to be joyful about. I'm not advocating that we should sing songs only for miserable Christians. But when we sing songs that are only about triumph and joy and blessing, then that can be deeply discouraging to the Christian who is going through seasons when they are sorrowful. I was saved at a Christian summer camp in Louisiana, based out of a church that was a mega church of about 3,000 that had a very much of a seeker-sensitive bent. And that camp high of being converted at that camp was incredible. But when I came back down to real life, I felt far from God when I experienced everyday normal emotions. When I left that mountaintop high. In our churches, can we honestly cry out with the psalmist when we're experiencing trials? Can a book like Lamentations even belong in a modern day worship service for us? Why is it when we read the Psalms, we as American Christians are so often shocked and scandalized by the way the psalmist talks to God and talks about the judgment of God and talks about the suffering they're going through in such an honest and brutal way? Well, what I want to try to do today is really address and answer three questions. First, how do we get here? What does the Bible say about lament, and what should we do about it? So first, I want to talk about how did we get here and look at the history, really of the last 2 centuries, of how our music has evolved in the church to become much more happy-clappy, much more forsaking of the sorrowful. Second, I want to ask, what does the Bible say? And really briefly, this is such a huge topic, just explore what the Bible says about songs of lament. And finally, I want to ask, what should we do about it, and offer up some practical suggestions so that you could apply these truths for yourselves and for your respective churches. And my prayer is that as we answer these questions, you could learn to treasure songs of lament like the Bible does, both for yourselves and for your churches. So first off, how did we get here? I think the reason that our modern songs don't reflect the biblical theology of lament is primarily due to 3 movements that we've seen in the last 200 years. First, theological liberalism. Secondly, the prosperity gospel. And third, consumeristic religion. Let's start with the first one, with theological liberalism. Many of you know in the 19th and 20th century, the Bible came under intense theological scrutiny. Can we even trust the Bible? Are the cities the Bible talks about even real? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? How can we believe in miracles like these old-fashioned people? And from this movement, we saw many denominations move away from the miracles of Jesus to the morality of Jesus. And now, today, these same denominations are abandoning even the morality of Jesus. And honestly, I'm not sure what's left. But this divide among Christian denominations affected our hymnals, in that the emphasis on the supernatural greatly declined. Even in churches where we would very much affirm the supernatural, there was a tendency to shy away from controversial. The focus, for instance, on heaven became greatly diminished because people did not want to become so heavenly minded that they were no earthly good. And there became much less singing about heaven. Mark Dever, who many of you know is like the 9 Marks guy, he said, if you look at 19th century hymnals, you'll find 100 to 200 hymns on the afterlife out of 600. If you look at 20th century hymnals, you'll find about 12 to 15 hymns out of 600 on the afterlife. And most of us are singing, if we're still singing out of the hymnals, out of 20th century, maybe 21st century hymnals. My church, for instance, published in 1968, our hymnal has roughly 21 hymns on heaven. So we're a little better than Mark Dever's assessment. But so on top of that, we saw that with the traditional hymns, that there's this movement away from the supernatural, and that hope of an afterlife. But also the prosperity gospel prospered in today in this historic rate of popularity. I mean, you go to Walmart and pick up Joyce Meyer and Joel Osteen at the checkout. It is absolutely insane how popular this teaching has become. And though I hope and pray, I'm sure many of you despise the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, a lot of it has seeped into mainstream evangelicalism through our music. You got Hillsong, Bethel, Elevation, which are all churches who preach a prosperity gospel. And their music is immensely popular in conservative evangelical churches. And think about prosperity theology for just a moment. The Word of Faith movement holds and maintains that our words have the power to create realities. You name it, you claim it, you blab it, you grab it. This is, you guys are familiar with this idea. The teaching goes that because God in Genesis 1 created the world by the power of His Word, we too possess that power because we're God's children. Some prosperity preachers like Creflo Dollar would even go so far as to say that we are little gods. So think about how this theology has affected the music that has come out of Hillsong, Bethel, Elevation. These songs may not preach the prosperity gospel explicitly, but they all follow the tone of the prosperity gospel. These songs are only about triumph and victory and blessing and joy because they want to speak good things over the lives of their people. Those churches do not produce songs about suffering and trials and confession of sin because that's totally out of line with the prosperity gospel. There may, of course, be some exceptions to the rules that you can think of if you know these bands. I'm not saying you shouldn't sing these bands, but think about how this has influenced our culture in such a subversive way. There are many exceptions, but these bands have dominated the evangelical landscape. And it comes from a place that believes that the Christian life is a blessed life, where if one possesses enough faith, they should be physically healthy, financially prosperous, and situationally happy. So we got liberalism, prosperity gospel, and then consumerism. This is a huge one. 400 years ago, you didn't have a choice of where you went to church. You didn't have a car. You didn't have the means to travel long distances, so your options were limited. But ever since the inventions of cars, which is not a bad thing, we all drove here today, hey, amen, that's introduced an element of choice and competition between churches. I've met people that live 5-6 minutes away from my church who drive 30 to 40 minutes away to go to another church just because they like the music there. And it's rare in America for someone to go to the church closest to where they live. Of course, I understand if the church that's closest to you has bad theology or is unhealthy, I'd get why you wouldn't want to go there. But largely, the average American who goes to church makes the decision of where they're going based on consumeristic preferences. Do I like the music? Are the people around me like me? Do they have something for the kids? Do I like the preaching? And so on. And I think all that has led to a rise of the seeker-sensitive movement. Really, all you need in America to grow a church is a good band with good music. Doesn't matter what you preach. Doesn't matter what you teach. I mean, really, a good band will draw crowds. It's a huge motivating factor. And this has led many churches to cater their music more and more towards unbelievers and the carnal. And honestly, on a normal day, what would you rather listen to? A song about victory or a song about suffering? When we only sing happy songs, that's going to be very attractive to a person who believes the lie that they can find perpetual happiness in this world, which they cannot. There is this kind of consumerism that drives a lot of professing Christians in America, and that has had an effect on the tone of the songs in our service. So I think that's how we got there. There's a lot more factors that could be, and there's exceptions to the rule. There's hymnals that are probably great in the 20th century. There's modern songs that are wonderful nowadays. But I'm saying this is the overall trend. And if you're sitting there, you're thinking, okay, Taylor, so what? What's the big deal? I'm not a liberal. I'm not preaching the prosperity gospel. I'm not for consumerism. Why can't we just sing happy songs all day long? Well, I'm glad you asked that, because let's briefly look at the theology of lament from the Bible. I think I even have it on your sheet, the Roman numeral 2. What does the Bible say? You've got these two scriptures. First, Colossians 3:16 says, "Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching, and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God." It's interesting to note that in Colossians, Paul tells us to teach and admonish through music. I think that the selection of hymns is a function of teaching in which the pastors or elders of the church instruct the church on what to believe. And that's a big deal, because if we're being honest, if the people are going to believe your sermon or the songs that you sing, what are they probably going to cling on to more? Well, the songs. just hear a sermon once, but you hear songs over and over. They've got melodies, they've got repetition, they've got things that resonate with your heart. If you want to know what a church really believes, look at what they sing. But notice that these three categories show up: psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Next, you look at Ephesians chapter 5, verses 18 through 19. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. So Timothy, it's okay to have a little wine for your stomach. Wine makes the man's heart glad, but don't get drunk. Instead of getting drunk, sing. And this strange exhortation from Paul. But once again, we see that phrase, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. We see these two things repeated. First, that we are to sing unto one another. So having one person on stage who sings and performs while the congregation listens is unbiblical and unhelpful. Songs are meant to respond to God, to praise Him, but there's also an element of teaching in which we sing to one another. Secondly, we see that phrase, psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, once again. What do these terms mean? I'm going to quote the New American Commentary on Philippians. Although there is a consensus that the terms have significant overlap and cannot be distinguished sharply, there is some help in seeing where they most differ. Psalms are no doubt the psalms of the Old Testament. The word hymn may describe a festive hymn of praise. Spiritual songs seem to describe other musical compositions, perhaps like gospel songs. Whatever they were, Paul cautioned that they must be spiritual, not secular. Together, these three terms address the entire scope of musical expression in early church worship. End quote. If someone's preached through these passages or done more study, I'd be really interested to hear what you've gleaned from that study. But whenever I hear these verses and I think about my church, we do a lot of hymns, we do some spiritual songs, we don't sing any psalms at all. And which is a strange command. This is a clear command from Scripture that we are to sing the Psalms. We have it twice. Which, hey, Paul, aren't we New Covenant Christians? Isn't that the Old Testament? Shouldn't we unhitch that? Shouldn't we leave that behind and move on and sing songs just about Jesus? Why are we singing songs about David and these psalmists from the Old Covenant? That doesn't make any sense, but not according to Paul. He says, no, these describe the emotions and the experience of your life as the new people of God. And the early church followed Paul's advice, because if you look at the history of the 2nd and 3rd century, the way music was conducted was usually by one of the elders standing up and singing a single line from the Psalms without music, and the congregation would sing that back to them. And it would just go on, and they'd do an entire psalm. And that's how music was conducted. I mean, think about it. They had no hymnals. There was no projectors. They had no Bibles. The Psalter was the early church's hymn book. And I would argue it was Jesus' hymn book as well. But should we be bothered that the Psalms are almost totally absent from our worship today? This entire topic was inspired by an article written by Carl Trueman, who wrote the article, What Do Miserable Christians Sing? And I highly recommend you all go read that article. It's listed at the back of your handout on the very bottom if you want the name of that. He also wrote a reflection 10 years after because it was so popular and helpful. And he did an interview on that article. And all those resources I'd highly recommend. But this is a quote from that first article. He says, "The Psalms, the Bible's own hymn book, have almost entirely dropped from view in the contemporary Western evangelical scene. I am not certain about why this should be, but I have an instinctive feel that it has more than a little to do with the fact that a high proportion of the Psalter is taken up with lamentation, with feeling sad, unhappy, and tormented and broken. In modern Western culture, these are simply not emotions which have much credibility. Sure, people still feel these things, but to admit that they're a normal part of one's everyday life is tantamount to admitting that one has failed in today's health, wealth, and happiness society." I talked to a guy recently on Facebook who he had liked this video asking for prayer requests. So I reached out to him and said, "Hey, I'm the pastor. I want to introduce myself, and how can I pray for you?" And he said, "Oh, I actually used to go to this church when I was young, but I don't believe in prayer anymore." And so I said, "Hey, if it's okay, I know I'm a random guy on the internet, but if I can ask, why don't you believe in prayer anymore?" And he sent me a long response, but it boiled down to this: how can God's plan be good when the evil get away with everything and the good suffer? And I sent him a long response, and I shared the gospel with him, as trying to reach out to him. But a part of my response was saying, you're saying what David said in Psalm 72. This was David's complaint against God. And the people of God not only believe this, but have sung this psalm for thousands of years. And there's a part of me that doesn't wonder that if this young man, when he came to Horicon Baptist Church, if we had sung psalms like Psalm 72, where would he be today? In the Lord's providence, he is where he is, and I had this opportunity to witness to him, but I wonder. When I was in Texas for my undergrad, I was moving from Louisiana, and I'd come from this large megachurch that sang happy clappy songs, very seeker sensitive, and I enjoyed a modern style. I'd grown up going to Catholic school. I despised the Catholic hymns. They were soulless. They were depressing. Even when I went to Presbyterian church or Episcopalian church or even the Baptist, I hated hymns, despised them. So I even told my friends, I refuse to go to a church with hymns. I want to go to a solid church. I'm looking for a solid church, but there's no way I'm going to a church with hymns. Well, you know what the Lord sent me? Sent me to a Reformed Baptist church that not only sang the hymns, but sang the psalms. And that was a hard adjustment for me. I love the people, love the pastor, love the preaching. The music was difficult for that transition. And I remember the song leader getting up, and he told us to turn to Psalm 3 in the Psalter, and it was to the tune of Amazing Grace. And it was very strange because, everyone knows Amazing Grace. I knew how to sing this. It was fine. I was reading the words. Oh, this is interesting. And then I became scandalized because if you know Psalm 3, that's where God punches evildoers in the face and breaks their teeth. And we sang that to the tune of Amazing Grace. And I felt wrong because how can we sing about God punching people in the face and breaking their teeth? But there it was. It was scripture. It was it was meant to be sung. And I knew it was true. Now, of course, I think the tune of Amazing Grace was a terrible selection for that song. Did not fit the mood at all. But there is an authenticity in the Psalms that is missing from much of our modern music today. And that is a problem. There is so much that could and should be said about a biblical theology of lament. I thought about even taking a whole song of lament and going through it. But I think most of us agree lament is biblical. Lament is good. It's a wonderful theology to explore. But I want to offer up the Psalms as a starting point for our worship, used to evaluate our worship today. We should ask ourselves the questions, do the songs we sing on Sunday reflect the cries of the psalmist? To quote Truman again, he said in an interview about the article he wrote, "In my own experience, I remember when my wife miscarried nearly 20 years ago. I remember being very grateful that we were at a church where at the time sang nothing but the Psalms. And I was very grateful that we went to a church where I knew that on Sunday, my wife and I would be able to honestly sing the words of the Psalms." Found in the Psalms are a treasure trove of content which reflects the authentic emotions of the life of a believer. And let me be clear, I'm not advocating exclusive psalmody. I'm not advocating that we should only sing songs. But what Truman said about honestly being able to sing on Sunday, I think that's the goal. And if our music were to reflect more of the biblical range of emotions, our people would be better prepared to face trials and suffering. We would be better prepared. And not only that, but church could also be a place where you go to honestly express those emotions in song. We are, as a people, 2 Corinthians 6:10 says, who are sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. And our music canon should reflect that. So I imagine some of you have some questions, which I'm sure we'll get into in the discussion. But let's say you're convinced. Let's say you're on board and saying, this is a valuable conversation to have. But Taylor, I have no idea where to start. The songs in my hymnal are just not like that. The music I listen to just isn't like that. I have no idea how to implement this in my church. Well, in this last section, to answer the question, what do we do now? I've got 3 ways that you can change the music of your church to better reflect the biblical spectrum of topics and emotions. So first off, I think it'd be wise to teach on passages of lament. Teach on passages about lament. To quote the great theologian Andrew Larson, never change anything in your church unless you have first taught about it. Andrew told me that when I first came here as a pastor, and that advice was incredibly helpful. If you start singing psalms and depressing hymns without explaining why, you'll get kicked back, and I think you'll deserve it. So teach first on these topics. If you teach on the Psalms, you'll get to Psalm 3, and you'll have to explain what lament is and why lament is a good thing. I loved whenever I got to John 11, where Jesus was weeping at the tomb of Lazarus, and got to express to my people that grief is not only good, it's godly. Because there's so often this misconception that we as Christians, because we believe in heaven, we should just not be affected by any pain here. But Jesus was about to see Lazarus in 5 minutes, yet he still wept. Still wept at his tomb. So preach on the topics of lament. Secondly, introduce change slowly. Introduce change slowly. I like what Tom Rainer said. Don't lead too far ahead. You need to lead, but don't get so far ahead of your people that they mistake you for the enemy and shoot you in the rear. Change is necessary, but learn the pace of change that is best for your church. You don't need to burn all your hymnals. You don't need to burn all your Hillsong albums and just do the first century thing of singing one line out of the hymnal after another. You don't need to go back to Geneva tunes all at once. The pace can be every now and then just introducing a song that reflects the attitude of lament. And then slowly, over time, I think the culture will change. But if you're sitting here thinking, where do I start? What hymns do I start with? Where would I even find hymns like that? Well, this last piece of advice I have for you, broaden your musical horizons. Seek to broaden your musical horizons. I'd encourage you to try to listen to music from solid artists, old and new, that reflect the spectrum of biblical emotion. Try to find hymnals, if you can, before the 1900s. It may even be helpful in your devotional time to read a hymn from one of these older hymnals and reflect on how the people of God sang and worshiped God in the past. An interesting place that you may want to go would even be the African American Heritage Hymnal, which I had not heard of until I came to this study. The black church in America has a unique perspective on suffering, and many of the hymns and tunes in that hymnal were developed under slavery and carry with them deep, deep themes. Listen to this quote from Frederick Douglass as he contemplated and thought on the singing of the slaves in his day. You know, Douglass used to be a slave and was freed. He said, "I have often been utterly astonished since I came to the North to find persons who could speak of the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment and happiness. It is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake. Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The songs of the slave represent the sorrow of his heart, and he is relieved by them, only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. At least such is my experience. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness. Crying for joy and singing for joy were alike uncommon to me while in the jaws of slavery. The singing of a man cast away upon a desolate island might be as appropriately considered as evidence of contentment and happiness as the singing of a slave. The songs of the one and the other are prompted by the same emotion." And of course, that's an extreme example of suffering, someone who's literally enslaved. But a lot of the hymns that developed out of that period are helpful for us as we suffer today. Many of them are hopeful and have this focus about heaven. But often the melody is somber and it's eerily beautiful. I'll also say that another way you can broaden your musical horizons is by looking for hymns in the minor key. So few of the hymns are in minor, and I think that once again that reflects the happy, clappy state of worship music both in traditional hymns and in modern ones. The tune of the song does matter. It changes the way that we sing the words. Some of you know the song "In Tenderness He Bought Me," which is an old hymn. That was revamped by the band Citizens and Saints to this very upbeat, wonderful music, and it's a very happy tune. And then the Sing Team, another band, took that song and took it down to a minor key, slowed it down, and it's a beautiful song to sing while suffering. And it's all about the cross and the blood of the cross, and it's fantastic. On the song specifically, here's some resources I'd recommend to you. There's some psalters you should check out. Many of you know the Trinity Hymnal, but there's also the Trinity Psalter, which would be its counterpart. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church just produced a few years ago a new Psalter that you may want to see. The Free Church of Scotland has 2 Psalters, one contemporary style, one traditional. Once again, this is not about contemporary versus traditional. There's also some fantastic modern contemporary musicians today who are putting out psalms that are beautiful. I think of Shane and Shane, Kristen and Keith Getty. They've both done contemporary versions of Psalms that are wonderful. I'd also highly recommend, if you don't know, Poor Bishop Hooper. This band is doing an every psalm project where they've just been for like once a week for the last 2 years putting out a psalm. I think they're in the 130s now. They're almost completed. But a lot of those songs, if your church does contemporary, it fit beautifully. They're singable. They're wonderful. Some of them are in the minor key, and they really complement the Psalms of Lament very well. So as we narrow down, there's 7 categories. So number one, I want you to think about the Psalms, but there's 7 categories for songs that we should sing as Christians when we think about what can miserable Christians think. And these categories come from Matt Merker. He's a pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist Church with Mark Dever. So number one, songs about individual confession of sin. Think about the hymn, Come Ye Sinners, Poor and Needy. Number 2, corporate confession of sin. There's a new version of Psalm 130 that's called From the Depths of Woes. That is absolutely wonderful. As I'm going through these categories, I'm going to name a number of hymns, and you will see that there's a big QR code on the back of your handout. If you scan that code with your phone, it'll go to a Spotify playlist, and it'll have all these songs and more. And in our discussion, I'm going to ask for more recommendations, and I'll add those as well to that playlist. But that playlist would be a good starting point. Number 3, we get minor key on the cross and the wrath of God. You think of like Sacred Head Now Wounded, Stricken, Smitten, and Afflicted. A modern one, Power of the Cross, is wonderful. Jesus Paid It All by King's Kaleidoscope. They took that song and put it in a minor key, and I think it's wonderful, and it has a much more lamenting feel to it. Number 4, Lament of General Suffering and Brokenness of the World. Oh, Dear Refuge of My Weary Soul. They've got a hymn version and a contemporary version. That one's wonderful. Whatever My God Ordains Is Right is wonderful to sing through suffering. Number 5, Songs of Reliance on God Through Personal Suffering. There's a song called Lord From Sorrow's Deep I Call that is fantastic. Songs of assurance and perseverance that you're going to make it to the end. He Will Hold Me Fast has been a great example. Many of you know that one. My church is as old as can be, sings the hymns, but they love that song. Finally, songs that express longing for the new heavens and new earth. All these don't have to have a sad song. We've been doing a song called Almost Home by Matt Papa and Matt Boswell, and the people have loved it. Especially a lot of them, they are almost home. Yeah. But that song was helpful to me as I was grieving to think, the suffering that we're having in this life, we're almost there. And that thought and having your eyes on heaven were so helpful. So I hope this conversation has been helpful. It's really just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg as we think about this biblical theology of lament. And I pray that it will bless you in a way so that when you suffer and when your people suffer, you and they will be properly equipped to go through those trials through one of the beautiful tools God has given us. Hi, Taylor Callen, pastor of Oregon Baptist Church. Thank you so much for listening to this sermon. I pray that you are more encouraged and love Jesus and the gospel more after hearing the sermon than when you first sat down to listen to it. Know that our heart at this church is that this sermon would be an encouragement to you and would be a useful resource, but would in no way replace the pastor that God has called to shepherd you or the church that you're called to be a member of. With that being said, if you want more information about our church or want to hear more sermons, go to HorecanBaptist.com.